Surf's up, recappers. Ellis here with another interview, this one virtual style. You'll want to make sure that oxygen tank is full for this one, because we're talking all things coral reef smartphone photogrammetry with Dr. Orion McCarthy of Seatrees and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. A marine ecologist, oceanographer, and conservationist, Dr. McCarthy has become a preeminent force in coral reefs restoration by telling their story in 3D. We explore how smartphones could be the best tools to save coral reefs, what happens if we lose them, partnering with Samsung, what AI could mean for marine ecosystems, and what makes Hawaii such a darned magical place. And yes, there is a wild story or two from the depths, so stick around. You won't see coral reefs the same way again. Dr. Orion McCarthy, science lead at Seatrees and project manager at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Welcome to the Recap Podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
It's a delight to have you. Thank you so much. You were recapped in issue number 44, which highlighted the photogrammetric partnership between Seatrees, Scripps, and Samsung. The goal at the onset was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the monitoring and restoration of 3 coral reefs in Indonesia, Fiji, and Florida using large area imagery. I have that mostly right?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So we're going to comb through the many fine details of that, the tech, along with your journey and that of Scripps and Seatrees. But I'd really like to start with what is endangered. So can you speak to the evolution of coral reefs' now troubling status? What is wrong? Why? And when did it start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So coral reefs are one of the most important ecosystems in the ocean. You can think of them as sort of the cities of the ocean because they occupy a very small amount of area. If you look at a map of where coral reefs are, you would really have to squint or zoom in to see where they are, but they are home to an estimated quarter of all marine life. So it's a lot of life really and diversity packed into a small space. So they're really important from that perspective, and that's partly because of the corals that grow and form this really complicated three-dimensional habitat that can host a diversity of life from different fish to a bunch of invertebrates that live inside the little nooks and crannies of an individual coral colony. And corals are animals that actually build this reef. They create this skeleton that if you have ever seen a coral on land and it looks white and hard like a rock, that is the skeleton that the coral animal is creating. And the coral, because it is alive and building the skeleton, it's constantly growing over time. And so what we want is a reef that is growing and sort of a living structure that is creating habitat for other species. And the challenge is that corals are sensitive to increases in temperature. And when the ocean gets too warm, the partnership that corals have with this tiny microscopic algae that lives inside the coral's tissue breaks down. And that's a problem because that algae is a coral's source of food. It allows corals to basically get nutrients from the sun, sugar, through photosynthesis that the algae does. And in that way, corals, they almost function like plants, even though they are animals, and they are able to do that because of this algae that lives inside of them. And it's when that partnership breaks down, corals actually lose their pigmentation and they look white because you're basically seeing through the coral's tissue to that white skeleton underneath. And again, that white skeleton is what, when we see a coral on land or in like a lab or an aquarium, just the hard skeleton you're able to touch, that's this thing you're seeing through the clear tissue to that skeleton underneath. And so if that water stays warm for too long, the coral actually starves to death because it's lost that algae that it's getting its food from. And then that coral starves, and all that's left is that skeleton, which eventually gets overgrown and will start to erode away over time. And so the challenge is if there's too much ocean warming and too quickly for corals to be able to adapt to, you start to lose the actual building block that is creating the reef and allowing it to grow over time, and the piece that's creating habitat for all these other animals. And so that's really what the challenge is of how do we maintain conditions where corals can continue to live and grow so that they can provide this habitat for all these other animals.
So coral bleaching. Now, when you speak of how we see the skeleton, does that term apply? That's what that is, mm-hmm. Yes?
Yes, that is bleaching. Yeah, and the important distinction there that I think a lot of people don't realize is when the coral has turned white, it is still alive. It's just in that stressed phase where it doesn't have the symbiotic algae inside of it anymore. And if the water temperature returns back to normal quick enough, the coral can regain that algae and get color back and recover. It's sort of like a person having a fever. Just because you have a fever doesn't mean you're dead. Ideally, you're not dead. You're able to recover from that fever, and your immune system does what it's supposed to do, and your temperature goes back down, and you are healthy again. And so, for corals, if we have sort of these fleeting or small heat waves, then they can recover and get better. But it's only if we have heat waves that are long enough that they eventually starve that you start to see corals dying and a reef that has a big drop in coral cover after a bleaching event.
So on the most macro level, if these sustained heat waves continue, what happens to these reefs?
It's a great question. That a lot of research is happening to try to figure out exactly what happens. I think on that macro level, you'll start to see a lot less reefs and a lot less coral cover on the reefs that do exist. But I think at a more detailed level, and the thing that a lot of coral reef scientists are interested in, you'll start to see a change in which types of corals are on a reef because there, as you might imagine, different corals, different species have different tolerance to heat, and some are much more stress tolerant and able to withstand high temperatures, and others are much more sensitive. Oftentimes, there's a trade-off where the ones that grow faster under good conditions and can really build a reef really quickly, those might be the ones that also die back the most when there's bleaching, whereas the ones that grow more slowly might be the ones that tend to do better when it gets warmer, relatively better compared to other corals. And so you'll start to see a shift in both the types of corals that live on a reef and how that reef behaves ecologically. If those corals provide different types of habitat, do different ecosystem services. So it's, I think there is a future with coral reefs under some amount of climate change, but those reefs will probably look different than the reefs we have now. And then once you get to certain levels of climate change, you start to really see a diminished amount of any types of corals and less ecosystem services from those reefs.
Goodness, much to address. Hence the three key parties aligning, though. So moving to this collaboration, what was the genesis of the Scripps, Seatrees, and Samsung partnership? I know you're the practitioner, but whatever you could speak to, how it came to be.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually did my PhD at Scripps before I came to Seatrees. And so I am sort of from the beginning more familiar with the Scripps side of things. And Scripps has been working with photogrammetry to study coral reefs since the like 2012 or 2013, when photogrammetry was very, very new on the scene for coral reef ecology. It was still very cumbersome to actually build a 3D model. A lot of R&D needed to do anything, especially any sort of analysis with the data. And the Scripps team really innovated and was leading the way in both the tech development, but also had been doing coral reef ecology surveys the old-fashioned way with either just single photos like photo quadrats or other sorts of visual surveys for many decades. And so basically taking that research apparatus to scale up photogrammetry to hundreds to thousands of surveys across the world through an initiative called the 100 Island Challenge that was led by Dr. Stuart Sandin and Dr. Jennifer Smith. And so through that, really, the Scripps team built up this really big expertise in how to use photogrammetry to document coral reefs and to monitor changes over time, and basically became a leader in the coral reef space around how to use photogrammetry, developed instruction guides of how to collect the imagery, trained a lot of other research partners on how to monitor coral reefs, and in this way built up a lot of capacity to help groups like Seatrees, which is very focused on the community side of things in terms of restoration, helping these small community-led groups to basically level up the restoration that they're doing. So in the Seatrees works across a number of different ecosystems, including mangrove forests, seagrass habitats, kelp forests, and coral reefs. And so in the coral projects, there's really the interest in trying to leverage the advances that Scripps had made with photogrammetry and to try to apply that for restoration practitioners so that they could use the phones or the cameras and technology to actually document the progress of their restoration projects. And the sort of missing link there is really user-friendly, cost-effective, easy technology, because as I was mentioning, when Scripps first started with photogrammetry, it was really challenging and new and needed a lot of development. And we've come a long way, but there still is a big barrier to entry for these groups to be able to use photogrammetry, whether it's the cost of cameras or the data storage required, or being able to process the data and get ecological, meaningful data out of it at the end. And so all of that is either expensive or time consuming. And so the goal with this partnership with Samsung is to leverage Samsung's phones, which are much more easily accessible and user friendly than more expensive cameras, to make that sort of the missing piece to help make this photogrammetry more accessible. And then also to try to streamline the image collection with the phone and the image upload and processing, so that restoration practitioner, all they really have to do is have a phone and take some pictures underwater, and then a lot of the other complicated and limiting aspects of the technology can either be streamlined or automated.
Fabulous. What has surprised you about working with a company like Samsung, either in terms of their commitment, capabilities, or even how they seek to understand reefs themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was coming at this before I even went to grad school. You have sort of, as someone in the environmental space, this view of big companies as they don't care. They're just sort of trying to do marketing, get their name out there. But the Samsung team really does seem to care about the environment. And I know they have a commitment to have upcycled ocean plastic in their phones. And then they truly are interested not only in just getting their phones into the water to help with science, but they want to see the 3D models that come out of it. They want to know the ecological status of the coral reefs and the updates to biodiversity that come from this. So they are genuinely interested in this broader project. And so that's been heartening to see that a company that wants to make a positive difference, and especially a technology company, inserting themselves not just in a way that is to put their name on something, but to help advance technology that can help the conservation of the ocean. Because there are so many emerging technologies that have the potential to be useful for conservation. It's just they need additional development to be made user-friendly and more useful for the conservation space. And I think that that's a perfect place for a technology company to really plug in, beyond just giving money, to actually provide some expertise to help move that forward.
You mentioned him, but I'd like to hone in on Dr. Stuart Sandin. Tell us more.
Yeah. I'm glad you got me on the podcast, but if you want a really eloquent speaker about photogrammetry and coral reefs, Dr. Stuart Sandin is the one
Noted.
to go to. He has a way of really painting quite a story and making it sound incredibly inspiring. And so Stuart has been at Scripps since, I believe, 2008. And his background is in coral reef ecology, and especially coral reef fish. And over time, as photogrammetry became more and more a focus of his lab really grew in its focus to really focus on corals in terms of coral reefs. And he has a really this deep interest in ecology, of understanding how the reef actually functions, like the population structure of corals, what it means for a reef to be actively growing or healthy, going to really remote islands and then also more populated islands, and looking on this global scale to see how coral reefs change across gradients of human impact, but also different oceanographic factors, and just this really genuine curiosity about how reefs work. And I think that is combined with a really, really refreshing level of optimism. I think Stuart views that reef disappearance is not a foregone conclusion, both from the perspective that there's still time for us to act to address climate change, but also that there are examples of hope spots of reefs that are doing better, and that if we can just leverage this technology to better understand those, we can try to fold that into conservation. So he's very solutions focused and optimistic, which is, I think, why he's a really good fit for Seatrees, which is focused on restoration and actually like taking the initiative to do something proactive to help the ocean. And then it's the perfect place for Samsung to, as a technology company, again, to sort of provide some of the resources and expertise to help the technology to advance so that that vision can get realized.
Okay, so we might get a hair esoteric here, but I want to hone in on a term I picked up in the initial press release about this collaboration. Can you explain microfragmentation?
Sure thing. Yeah, microfragmentation is basically a restoration hack that allows us to use geometry to make coral restoration go faster. So basically, if you take a coral, you can actually cut it into a bunch of small pieces that will still survive, and they basically function as clones of each other, and then each one grows. And when a coral is small, because of the geometry of it, it has more surface area relative to the size of that coral, so it actually grows faster at the beginning of growth. And then as the coral gets really big, it sort of slows down relative in its growth rate relative to its size. So if you take a parent colony, cut it up into a bunch of small pieces, and space those pieces out, they can actually speed up that initial growth, and they can grow into each other and fuse to make a big colony. And then you can basically get to a big colony size in a much faster amount of time than if you started with a small individual fragment and just let it grow over time. So it's really a way of trying to counter that if we have bleaching events that become more and more frequent and we have less time for corals to recover in between them, if we can use restoration to try to speed up coral growth, we can try to make up some of that lost ground that climate change is throwing at us by making a shorter recovery time in between each
Very
disturbance.
savvy. Love it. So can you describe the rig or rigs used in these projects?
Yeah, so there's a variety of approaches. For the Scripps team, before Samsung came into play, their standard approach is to actually use two like DSLR Nikon cameras that are attached to this custom rig that essentially is like a big rectangular prism that each camera gets screwed into. And then to make that a little bit easier for the restoration folks using the phones, it's basically some like jerry-rigged PVC pipe that the phones can get screwed into. So using like accessible equipment that people can find their local hardware store. But honestly, you can even do it without any sort of rig as long as you get good overlap between the pictures. A diver who just has a phone in their hand could go out and collect the imagery.
Teammate talk. Who's likely with you in the water?
Yeah. So for I actually am not the one collecting the imagery for the Seatrees projects. Those are our local project partners who are on the ground and who have been trained to go out there and collect the imagery of their projects where they're actually doing restoration. So it's great that they already know their sites so well, and they are the ones doing the planting, and so they're able to very expertly navigate those sites and take the pictures and then upload them. And then the team at Scripps is the one building those into a 3D model using Agisoft Metashape. But when I was at Scripps, I did a lot of image collection with other researchers at Scripps. My research was primarily focused on Maui, but I also was able to go do field work in Palmyra Atoll, which is in the center of the Pacific Ocean. And I also did some field work in Micronesia, and then even helped with some field work that was in like coastal California and San Diego. And some of that was underwater and some was even above water, imaging the intertidal zone, like the tide pools. So lots of different types of photogrammetry.
We should say,
work.
I think you teed me up nicely. Scripps is officially a part of UCSD, right? University of California, San Diego?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. We like to say that UC San Diego is in La Jolla because Scripps was there first. And then like Scripps got absorbed into UCSD later as it became like a big state school institution. So now Scripps is a department within UC San Diego.
Thank you for the clarity.
Yeah.
One thing I want to circle back on, you also briefly mentioned this, and it may not even be part of this particular project, but it's certainly under conservation. Kelp restoration and what might distinguish that from coral reefs.
Yeah. So there's all the different sort of marine habitats that Seatrees works in, whether it's seagrass or kelp or coral. They all help to provide habitat, but each foundation species, the species that's growing and providing that habitat, has a different way of reproducing and often a different method that makes the most sense for growing and outplanting it to do restoration. And so corals grow slowly, they stay in one place, and have a different life cycle as an animal than kelp does as a seaweed. And so kelp restoration, oftentimes, instead of focusing on one individual outplant in the same way like coral, you're taking a fragment or a whole colony, you're putting it out on the reef and you're tracking that colony. Oftentimes kelp is more focused on the actual spores and the growth of basically the very little baby kelp and trying to make it so that there's way more kelp. And so one of the approaches that often gets used is called green gravel, where you actually get those spores to land on a bunch of small rocks, and then those rocks are primed to grow into kelp when they're in the right conditions. And so if you can spread those green gravel around in a kelp forest, as long as they can get stabilized once the kelp starts growing, it's a great way of like seeding a kelp forest. And so that's one of the several different types of approaches for kelp restoration.
I wanted to address an earlier technological effort on your part. You, if I have this right, organized and facilitated a 30-person workshop to identify community priorities for large area imagery capacity building efforts in the Virgin Islands. I was curious what you've learned about people from your advocacy for technology or conservation.
Yeah, it's a great question. That workshop, that was back in fall of last year, and we're hoping to get an NSF grant out of that. The part of that workshop was to work with the restoration folks down in the U.S. Virgin Islands to come up with a collaborative plan about how they could basically build capacity for them to use large area imagery to monitor their reefs. And so there's a big focus on bringing in the broader community and trying to use the visuals from the 3D models as a communication tool to help the broader community see what's going on under the water with the coral reefs. And it emphasized how people want to be using technology. They want to be leveraging the power of visuals to tell stories in places that are local and important to them. It's really just that there are real world barriers that make it hard to use technology, especially in sort of resource limited locations like the US Virgin Islands. And so it highlighted just like it would be such a missed opportunity if we don't invest in accessibility in conservation technology, because the places in the world where conservation is most needed are also usually places that are resource limited. And if we make the monitoring and the ability to tell those visual stories something that only some people can do, you're sort of setting up a system where people who are not from those places are the ones telling the stories, and you're going to miss a lot of the important aspects of the story if an outsider is the one telling those. And then the people who could be really invested in telling that story aren't included. So it's just, I think, highlights how important, especially in a person-centric field like conservation, how important it is to have people and technology together working on this, and not just a technology component by itself.
So, Doctor, I'm curious if you have to battle misinformation about marine conservation.
Yeah, I think it's you definitely have the challenge of people thinking that if they do one small thing, that is what's going to save the ocean. And we do want people to be taking initiative and doing whatever they can in their daily lives to make a difference. But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the structural things in our society that are driving ocean degradation or any sort of environmental degradation are beyond the scope of just using a different sunscreen to protect the corals or giving up straws. And I don't want to say that to discourage those things, but I think that oftentimes people will ask me if their sunscreen makes an impact. And I usually say that the flight that you take to go visit that reef is going to have a bigger impact on those corals, because again, if climate change is the biggest thing threatening the corals, and that's not to say that you shouldn't visit coral reefs. We do want people to get to experience these places. It's more saying that while we should, as individuals, care and act in ways that are good for the environment, we also should expect that the way we travel, the way we get electricity, should be in a more climate friendly mode so that we can continue with our lives, but also not be having this huge impact that's causing these ecosystems to disappear. So I think sometimes you have the individual actions dangled as a distraction to prevent that broader systems change. And we need that broader systems change to make sure that we can actually draw down emissions and reduce our impacts in a way that can reach the scale that we need in order to make sure that coral reefs can stick around for the future.
Uber insightful. Thank you for that. We've already discussed numerous disciplines, forms of conservation, your PhD. I'm curious from your vantage point, what makes a great research paper?
Yeah, I think that a great research paper, just like a 3D model of a coral reef, can be so compelling because it can tell a story. I think research papers that strive to not to have a bent or an agenda, but can tell a compelling story based on the data that they found and what they observed, written in with not too much jargon, and can really highlight through the arc of the paper, like to have an actual story arc, and to pull in different threads to really make a case beyond their specific narrow focus in that study, why what they did and what they learned has this broader implication. So I think focusing on how your insights fit into a broader picture and doing that in a way that people can relate to, which is stories.
So visual storytelling, photogrammetry. Do you have a moment when you realized photogrammetry could do something that no dive, no single photo, no data chart ever could?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like every time I give a presentation and put up visuals of change over time with photogrammetry, and I see how people react to that specific part of the presentation, even people who are in the marine conservation space and know these concepts and deal with this all the time, it really brings home to me like this is a mode of visualization and a technology that really has potential to make a difference. And I think I even experienced that the first time when I was trying to choose where to go to grad school, and I was looking at different programs and came across the 100 Island Challenge YouTube channel, which again, the 100 Island Challenge is the large area imaging surveys that Scripps has been doing for years that cover sites around the world. And so I could basically on this YouTube channel virtually explore reefs in incredible detail from all over the world and really start to get my creative juices flowing and excitement about if I were to go to school here, these are the types of places I could see. And as much as I did get to do cool field work while I was at Scripps, it was also cool as a scientist to be able to study even more different types of reefs that I never would actually get to visit, especially reefs back in time that there's no way to visit them now, but at least you can see what those places used to look like. So I think the ability to time travel, to share those stories with other people, regardless of location, like that captivated me, and I've seen it captivate other people. So I think that's really the power of photogrammetry for coral reefs.
That's magnificent. And you're really illustrating a point that I think it's a beautiful pairing when you were talking about the lowering of barriers in the Samsung aspect and what they're doing for that. So they're lowering a barrier, but simultaneously sort of elevating knowledge and stories and ultimately just the dissemination of really valuable information, right? And ultimately, it's tremendous.
Yeah.
Why is a 3D model so promising for showcasing reef recovery?
Yeah. Yeah. As I was mentioning earlier, because reefs, the corals create the three-dimensional structure that forms a reef and that creates habitat for other animals to use. And so it is useful to have a 2D view, and that can communicate quite a bit of change. But the 3D is really, it's how we experience a reef. It's how the animals experience the reef. And when corals grow, they're growing in 3 dimensions. And so to be able to capture that change in a way that feels very visceral, of like you can see that increase in habitat, that is, I think, something that would be lost if you only had 2D. And again, 2D is still a big improvement on the way we used to do things, where you either had a photo quadrat, where you basically took a single picture of the reef at a predetermined point on a transect. And so then your view of the reef was just like maybe 1 meter squared. And so even though you could get ecological data out of that in terms of being able to visualize the ecosystem, only the diver who was there in the water has a sense of what that reef looks like at a landscape level. That you can't get that just from that single picture. And before that, people would just go along a transect tape, and then at every set interval, they would write down what species was underneath the transect. And that's even less insight to the non-scientist who wasn't there at the time of what that reef looked like. So I think that as we move down this continuum of more immersive and realistic reconstructions of the reef, the more it allows other people to come into the fold and experience it with us, and not just the scientist who is collecting the data.
Have you ever had to choose between better data and reef safety?
That's a good question. I've had to choose between better data and personal safety.
Do tell.
Because on a scuba dive, there's sort of and this is true beyond photogrammetry. I think that they teach you this when you're scientific diving, of like there's always the temptation to get another data point, but it's like one data point is not going to change your results so much that it's like worth risking your personal safety. If you're scuba diving and low on air, like you should never be pushing those bounds. But I mean, there's also like the ocean conditions might change in the middle of a dive, and you have to make the decision of like, should we, like, we do need to get more images to fully reconstruct this site, but is it worth like potentially surfacing a kilometer away from the boat and not being able to have them find us? And so those sorts of trade-off and split-second decisions are more realistic than like a shark is going to come eat us while we're doing our survey, which I get that question a lot from people who are like, you scuba dive, aren't you afraid? And they're like, well, the ocean could get me. I'm not as afraid of like the sharks or any of the other animals down there. But yeah, I think that almost always the decision is on the side of like personal safety in practice, personal safety over getting that data. And I think that's the way that it should be in terms of we can't collect more data if we aren't here anymore. So in the long run, personal safety will allow us to get more data.
Certainly.
In the future.
I got to ask though, and sharks aside, do you have a sort of hallmark, just indelible, it doesn't have to be terrifying moment, but intense moment that you can recall?
There was a survey that was at Palmyra Atoll, that like 2 hours south of Hawaii, out in the middle of the Pacific, and some sites we were doing where the current really kicked up, and it was like, to be able to do a proper photogrammetry survey of a reef, you have to be able to swim in a grid or some pattern that allows you to get good coverage over the reef. And if you have current above a certain level, you're not really going to be able to fight that current enough to be able to get good coverage. And we were sort of down there and realizing that it was really going to be hard to be able to get good coverage without sort of pushing past the amount of time could be down there. And so like aborted the dive partway through. And I mean, the way that our surveys are set up is that you'll do a bunch of parallel passes in one direction, and then you'll switch and do them in the other. And so there is some redundancy built in there, because if you do good enough overlap in one direction, in theory, you could still get a 3D model out of that. The second set of passes is really just insurance. So I think we even were able to get a mostly good 3D model of that site. But again, it's sort of like in the moment, your heart's pounding. You're like, we need to make sure we get out of here and get back to the boat, which thankfully was right there when we came up, and we didn't have to like have them search around for us. But in the moment, it feels a little, your heart's beating a little bit faster.
I can only imagine. Bravo, bravo. You wrote an outstanding piece, we'll link to it in the show notes for our listeners, in which you describe large area imagery as a tool that peels back the ocean. I think I've had the words right, for everyone, even those without scuba certification. Can you share a moment when this virtual access profoundly impacted someone's understanding or connection to any marine ecosystem?
Yeah, I'll actually share a story that Stuart likes to share a lot, which is when he was in, I believe it was Palau, doing some field work. They collected imagery, and then later they were meeting with I believe it was a local chief and some others in the community, especially in the fishing community, and showed them the 3D model. And the chief's response was, this gives the reef a voice. Like whenever we go fishing, we have the fish afterwards. And if the fish are getting smaller over time, that tells us something about the ecosystem. But we don't have that for the corals because we're not getting in the water. We don't see that. And so there isn't a voice advocating for the corals under the status quo. But having this visual, it actually gives the reef a voice. And then we're more likely to make decisions that account for the reef because we have that voice as part of the equation. So that's just sort of one example of it impacting how we talk about the reef and how it could factor into how we treat it and how we make decisions about
Beautiful. Doctor, do you think AGI, artificial general intelligence, would play a small, moderate, or huge role in advancing underwater photogrammetry?
That's a great question. I think there's potential in both directions here. I think from on a positive side of things, AI, I mean AGI, but even just the AI we have now has potential to advance or speed up our analysis of imagery, especially to do species ID, to start to recognize patterns, and basically building on the foundation of ecology we already have, and basically just allowing us to do data analysis over a much larger area than we currently do, which has great potential to improve monitoring, especially if we have restoration or like a management program where we need to be looking over a very large area. The main bottleneck right now is sort of human analysis time to be able to do that. And so I think it really opens up this big frontier in what we can learn and what we can monitor. So that's the exciting part. But there is sort of the cautionary part of the more we take people out of the equation, the more people might be disconnected from the trends that we're seeing, and not involved in observing those trends. I remember when I was, as part of my PhD, was doing a survey of people like coral reef practitioners who either could use large area imagery, or who were already using it. And one of the folks I spoke with was talking about these divers in the Philippines who they fished for part of the week, and the other part of the week they were going out and doing monitoring on the local coral reef. And they were not high tech. They just had a clipboard underwater and were recording things. But them actually being on the reef, they were the voice that went back into the community and told them how the reef was doing. And so if you were to basically either through underwater vehicles taking pictures, or even divers taking pictures, but then none of the analysis and end results coming from those divers, if that all gets automated, then you lose that key voice. And because conservation so often is about getting people to change their behavior, like the more that you take people out of the equation, the harder it can be to make a person-centered either behavior change or decision. So I think that we just need to be careful, as with most things with AI, in terms of how it's deployed and making sure it's deployed for maximum benefit while avoiding some of those challenges.
If you had to pick one term, are you optimistic or pessimistic about it?
I think in my general life, I'm pessimistic about AI. I think in the coral reef space,
Okay.
I'm more optimistic.
Great nuance. When did you know you wanted to devote your career to conservation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I've known I wanted to work in conservation actually a lot longer than I knew I wanted to work in marine science or with
Okay.
corals in particular. I grew up in just outside of Washington, D.C., so not right next to the ocean. I mean, I loved going snorkeling on vacation and was very interested in sea creatures, as a lot of kids are, but I mostly was exposed to the environment and topics about nature through going to the zoo, going to the aquarium, watching nature documentaries. And so the information was presented to me very much in a conservation focused way of like, these animals are cool, but we also need to act to protect them. So I think that tremendous props to zoos and aquariums. They play a great role in trying to get us to, as a general public, to care about the environment. It definitely worked on me. And as I grew up and was deciding where to go to college, decided to major in ecology and evolution. And after that was focused on getting like internships and early career experiences in conservation. And it was through that that I started to get experiences that were more marine focused, whether it was fisheries or marine spatial planning or ocean policy, and those sort of built on each other and allowed me to get more marine related experiences. And I also, when I was an undergrad, did study abroad in Australia, which I was able to see the Great Barrier Reef and learn about coral reef ecology in a much more intimate setting. And so that really helped to pique my interest to the point when I was considering where to go to grad school. It was also around the time of the global coral bleaching event that happened in 2014 to 2017. And so that was in the news a lot and as a really pressing problem. And so I was like, if I'm going to devote myself to one topic area and that is related to conservation, coral reef conservation seems like a great fit. And fortunately, that's what worked out. But my interest is broader than just coral reefs, and that's partly why I enjoy Seatrees, where I get to work with a bunch of different ecosystems all around the world. And so my hope is that my career trajectory touches more parts of conservation than just coral reefs. As much as I love working with coral reefs, I would like to have as broad-reaching an impact as I can.
As would we all, Dr. Not. A couple things on your studies. In earning your PhD, you mentioned Australia, so that box is checked. But if I have it right, you spent extensive time in the Maui Nui region of Hawaii, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What about that place and experience made any sort of lasting impact on you?
Oh my God, yeah, that's been a huge impact, both sort of on a personal level and also on a scientific level of how I think about reefs and environmental change. I think the focus of our research in Maui was really long-term monitoring. We have a bunch of different photogrammetry sites that are spread around the leeward side, so the sheltered side of Maui and some of the neighboring islands. And it's a study that's set up to sort of look for human impact and signatures of human impact because Maui has a lot more people than some of the neighboring islands. One of the neighboring islands, Kaho'olawe, has no fishing allowed and really limited amount of people allowed to go there because it used to actually be used by the U.S. Navy during World War II and afterward as like a munitions testing site. So there's still a lot of unexploded ordinances. So back to my answer about personal safety on a dive, like making sure you don't accidentally touch a mine while you're underwater, always fun. But yeah, so it was like from a research perspective, being interested in, so what is causing differences in the reefs between the different places? Is it people? Is it other environmental factors like differences in water temperature? But the sites aren't really that far apart. So oftentimes the oceanography might not be that different, but maybe you have different land-based impacts, like a lot more sediment coming in on one island or a lot more fishing on another island. And then looking at how these sites were doing over time and seeing that in a lot of cases, it didn't map onto any of that. And just understanding that on a site-by-site level, these reefs are so different, even though so much of the other conditions around them are the same. And it was a humbling experience of, even though we know on a macro scale that overfishing is bad, that too many people near a reef is often going to cause pollution and that sort of thing, that warmer water is going to be bad for corals. Knowing that on a global level or even a regional level, like that's well supported. But once you start zooming in to a single coastline and trying to explain the variation, like I went into grad school thinking we knew so much and we were ready to just jump in and make a bunch of decisions. And then doing this research and realizing that there's still so much unknown at that local level. And the local level is important because that's often where we're making decisions about where are we going to outplant these corals? Where are we going to put this no fishing zone? And so being able to like make conservation decisions that are informed at that local level is still really challenging. And I think that's part of the reason why people like Stuart and myself are passionate about photogrammetry, is because you have that added power of the visual to help tell the story of a local place. And so it's being able to tell those site-specific stories that can help inform conservation is an added benefit to having data from a monitoring program. So from a scientific perspective, it really helped to bolster my understanding of sort of that site level nuance and how important local context is when doing conservation. And then on a more personal level, I mean, I was doing field work in Maui through it's kind of a tumultuous time. Like there was COVID for part of it, where it led to massive changes in the amount of people who were on that island. I think some people benefited from that, some people didn't. And then afterwards, I was actually doing field work there just a few weeks before the massive West Maui wildfires in 2023 that decimated Lahaina. And I mean, we had stayed in Lahaina multiple years. We had friends on island who lived in Lahaina, and just it was just this terrible tragedy. And to see this community of people that had welcomed us in and been there for us when we go to do the field work, just completely decimated like that. It really highlighted how, like, we had been focused on how climate change was impacting the coral reefs and didn't even really think about what else it could do on Maui. And it just was a stark reminder of how climate change is going to touch all of us. And in a lot of cases, I don't want to say unexpected ways, because we know that wildfires are a threat, but in ways that you personally might not expect, especially when a place gets irreparably changed or something like that. So it's been just following the story from afar, like hopeful that the recovery will go in a way that will allow people who've lived there for generations to continue living there. But yeah, I mean, Hawaii is struggling with a lot, whether it's cost of living or climate change or all these different things. And it's just made me really appreciative of the natural beauty, but also mindful of the challenges that people face with trying to sustainably exist out there.
Surely. If you'll pardon the clinging to a horrendous memory, but it just piqued my curiosity. Does a sprawling fire like that could that have a direct impact on, or is it a really novice question perhaps, but on a reef? I mean, ash or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we were acutely interested in that. And I think the jury is still out somewhat, but I will say that we were encouraged when we went back in 2024. We actually added some new sites that were really close to the burn scar. And there was that concern that, that as my advisor, Jen Smith, said, that like anything that you were storing in your garage, all the like paint and other toxic chemicals, like all of that got burned, and there's the potential for those toxins to wash into the water. So I know a lot of people were afraid of like, can I go swimming? Can I eat fish that I catch? And so a lot of those water quality questions were not going to be answered with photogrammetry. There were other groups there that were testing water quality. And I think they did find some elevated levels of copper and a few other things. I mean, all the boats that were in the harbor burned and sank. So there's plenty of potential ways for that to make it into the water. But thankfully, the reefs themselves looked like they did before. And so I think I have been heartened by the resilience of Maui's coral reefs throughout the course of studying them. They've been able to bounce back from bleaching. They have much higher coral cover than some other parts of the world. I mean, some of the reefs on the neighboring islands where there's less people, they're almost entirely covered in coral, and you rarely see that in places. And so I think that they're special ecosystems that we need to make sure that we continue to monitor them as Lahaina rebuilds, because there is always the impact, not just of the fire, but of coastal development. And like if the sewage system got damaged by the fire, and if that doesn't get repaired properly, you might have this chronic influx of nutrients and pollutants that you both have sort of that acute disturbance from the fire that all happens at once. And then if things don't get rebuilt in a good way, you could have an emerging chronic impact that could also have detrimental effects on the reef. They also relocated a lot of the waste and the debris from the fire to a dump site that's just upslope from the Olawalu Reef, which is one of the most culturally important sites in terms of coral in Hawaii. So there's sort of all sorts of concerns that just highlight the need to continue monitoring in this place, so that if there is change, we can have sort of a early warning signal and way to detect that and try to course correct.
I've got to ask this. Do I have this right that we have a sizable GIS audience, actually? Did you minor in GIS?
I did at University of Maryland, and they actually have a pretty leading GIS department. And I didn't have a lot of exposure to GIS before undergrad. A lot of was interested in maps and geography, but nothing more than that. And admittedly have not leaned into the GIS side of my background as much since going to grad school, because sort of went in more I guess remote sensing falls under GIS, but not as much creating maps, but more leaning into the remote sensing and photogrammetry side of things with just the research that I've been doing at Scripps. But I think I like to use GIS as an analogy for photogrammetry from like the ArcGIS side of things, of technology that has been so transformational in the conservation space and is now widely used, but was not always that way and used to be more technically challenging to do. And so I think I would love to see a similar revolution in the conservation space happen with photogrammetry, with eDNA and bioacoustics and some of the other emerging technologies where they can become as widely implemented in geographically diverse places by diverse people, just the same way that ArcGIS is. And so I think we should really look to that as a model of building a community of users that has with products that are tailored to those different users and trying to make things as user-friendly as possible.
So, Doctor, you clearly had your pick of the litter as to early on where you wanted to sharpen your axe, as it were. What led you to Scripps?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, Scripps has partly the name recognition of when I was starting to look at schools, I like Scripps was one of the ones at the top of the list. And as I was mentioning earlier in the conversation, being able to see an example of the types of reefs and the types of data that we would be working with was a really something that really gave Scripps the edge in terms of capturing my interest. But I mean, it's also, once I was there, it was just such a treat, not only to be in San Diego, which is really a great place to live, but also to be surrounded by a community of other oceanographers who are all working on these really in-depth and interesting topics. That was a new experience for me, and that ended up being one of the things I valued most about my time in grad school. So I think both the name recognition, the type of data that we would be able to work with, the community, and then really the ability to do field work in places all around the world. I knew that my career, like oftentimes people start with field work and then eventually become sort of more managerial or high level where they're not the ones doing field work anymore. And I wanted to make sure that I used grad school as a time to actually get out there and see these places that I would be talking about for the rest of my career and really make that imprint. And so Scripps gave me and gives others the opportunity to go do that and to see things firsthand. And I think that is a really, it's foundational to our understanding of these places, and it shapes how we think about them and communicate them for the rest of our careers. So I was really feel fortunate that I was able to get those experiences.
When it comes to working underwater, perhaps just conservation, is there anything your PhD did not prepare you for?
Well, I get seasick, so I don't think any amount of there was nothing that was going to fully prepare me for that. It was helpful, though. One of the really leading faculty members at Scripps, who was teaching a class that I was in during my first year, I remember we went out on like a one-day field trip, and thankfully I didn't get sick during that trip, but I felt queasy. And she told us that she still gets seasick. And so to see that was possible to still go into this field and have like a decorated career, even if your body doesn't want you to be on a boat, it was encouraging to hear that bit of feedback. So that's one thing that the PhD didn't prepare me for, but I wouldn't expect it to.
Do you, I must ask, do you hop on the Dopamine train and every fieldwork session?
I have not found one thing that always works. I was doing the scopolamine patches for a while, like behind the ear, and that was like the side effects from that of like dry mouth and then having to pee constantly. It was just, and then it wasn't a surefire thing that it would help the seasickness. And I think if it's like minor enough conditions, I can like Dramamine helps and I'm fine. Like thankfully Maui is a pretty sheltered place to be doing field work. I'm not like in the Southern Ocean or something, but then there'll be times where I'm like, I just know that the first day of any sort of trip, I'm going to be useless and curled up on the boat and like just have to get through it. And it's as long as you know that it's like going to be better the next day. Like I eventually get my sea legs and it's fine. So just a lot of powering through it, unfortunately. But I think other things that about the PhD, less about working underwater, but just in terms of being self-directed, that's been because so much of the PhD is you're not done after a certain amount of time. You're done when you finish your research. And I think that can be really challenging for people. And it was challenging for me too, because there's like COVID was right in the middle of my PhD and just trying to motivate yourself when like the world is going through crazy stuff and there's not a lot of other distractions, like personal events and things that you can use to like split in between the chunks of time you're working on research. And so like just trying to power through the PhD, viewing it as a marathon and structuring it in a way that you're both accountable and making progress, but not so focused on making progress that it becomes everything in your life. And it's a really hard needle to thread. And I don't know of anyone who's done it perfectly, especially because like over the course of 5 or 6 years, you could be doing it a little too much on one side for a while and a little too much on the other. So I think that like just trying to be as kind to yourself as possible as you're going through that, because it is a challenging period. And even beyond like the research you're doing, you're learning so much about yourself, and how to function as like essentially like kind of your own boss and like holding yourself accountable. And it's just a challenging time, but it's worth it, and you gain a lot of good skills going through
Certainly.
it. So
Self-care, folks. Don't sleep on it. Have you ever encountered a tension between the visual storytelling you enjoy and scientific accuracy?
yeah, I think the visuals are actually really helpful for that because they can show a lot of detail in a limited amount of time. Whereas when you're talking about something, like there's almost always a lot of nuance when it comes to science. And if you're trying to explain things in an elevator pitch or to really grab people's attention, sometimes you have to gloss over that nuance. But I think photos and videos have a way of doing that a little bit better, where you can show more depth and information than necessarily having to paint a picture for someone with your words. And I think that there's a lot of tools that we try to use to make our visuals a little bit more compelling and to try to highlight specific scientific points that we're trying to convey. Like I know we have some visuals that when you layer two different surveys from the same place but different years on top of each other, there's like this red and blue effect where stuff that has grown over time is blue and stuff that's structure that's been lost is in red. And it just like clicks instantly for people of this is how the reef has changed. And wow, look at that coral growth, look at that erosion. And that's a way of like communicating something very quickly and succinctly without really having to compromise on the scientific accuracy at all. So I think there's really a lot of advantages to the visuals for that.
You work to save something you cherish. Do you have days when you get discouraged?
Definitely. And I think it's important, just like the self-care when it comes to the PhD, the self-care for anyone working in the environmental field, especially like whenever you are working really hard on something. I know that when I was working in DC in an ocean policy job before starting at Scripps, and it was back a few administrations ago, and it was like I was there during the change of administration where early on we were working on a bunch of things and then watched them get undone over the course of several months. And like that is discouraging. There's really no way to slice and dice that. And the whole 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing, I think is true, but then also it doesn't feel great when you're experiencing the 1 step back. So I think that on a more like immediate how the world is impacting the work you're doing. And it took a while to learn that it's definitely going to be the work you do is having an impact, but it's a small and specific impact for most people, and just learning to accept that and to acknowledge like what your actions are actually having an impact on, and really valuing that, like valuing the impact that you do have, because it's difficult to have a lasting impact of any sort in this world. And so whatever you can do that's an impact for good, really placing value in that. And even if it doesn't by yourself save the future of coral reefs or stop climate change, if you helped to get enough people to change the way they view things or get access to something they didn't have access to before so that they can pursue their interests to help save coral reefs or stop climate change, like just trying to really, really see those as wins.
So quick question. You mentioned, if I recall correctly earlier, that the sheer number of people in or around a reef could impact its health. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So there's multiple different ways that that can take shape. From the most direct of, if you can imagine a bunch of tourists are snorkeling over a reef and they're stepping on it and breaking the corals, like obviously that's going to have a negative impact. And there's research to support that the sunscreen that people are wearing can also impact the reef. And I think that in super high densities of people, that is true. I think it's lower down on the list of threats that reefs face compared to things like climate change. Another way that people indirectly impact reefs through a big population is through fishing. And it's taking a fish off of the reef isn't so much directly impacting the coral, but a lot of fish are providing a service to the corals. They're acting like little lawnmowers. They're going in and they're eating the other algae that's growing on the reef that is competing with that coral for space. And earlier in the conversation, I mentioned microalgae that lives inside the corals, but there's also macroalgae that grows on the reef and is competing with those corals. So it can be a little tricky, but essentially the fish help to keep that balance where the corals can actually have space to grow. And so by taking too many fish off the reef with overfishing, that balance can sort of go out of whack and the corals suffer. And then, so that overfishing, especially if there's also a lot of nutrient pollution from sewer systems or wastewater, other sort of runoff from human populations, that combined with overfishing can be really bad because that influx of nutrients can cause algae to grow faster. The fish aren't taking away the algae. Other negative things in the water, bad water quality can make it even harder for the corals to grow. And sort of you get this chronic set of stressors that cause reefs to just be really sick and stunted over a longer period of time. And then those reefs are actually not well positioned to respond to things like bleaching events because they're already in a compromised state. And so that's a lot of the focus of conservation efforts because we both need global action to address climate change. But if you're a small natural resources department on an island that doesn't have jurisdiction over the global carbon emissions and you need to do something, their focus is often on those local regulations to control overfishing, to control like how wastewater gets managed, to control where tourists are allowed to go. So those sorts of local decisions are really critical to giving reefs a fighting chance to withstand climate change because they help to reduce those chronic impacts that really compromise a reef's health. So it's a really important connection between that local human population and those threats and pressures and the health of a reef.
Tremendous clarity. I posed that question actually from a personal POV. So probably the number one travel memory I have, one of the greatest memories of my life was Hanauma Bay. Now I know is nothing way below your pay grade, but for unknowing wanderers like me, I mean it was just transformative.
No, it's a fantastic spot. Yeah.
I posed the question for the hard truth because I just looked around. Long story short, I was really on the fence then and there about on a subjective level, I was enjoying myself to the nth degree. And then objectively, just looking around and just the swaths of people and God knows what sunscreen and kids spilling a Coke in the water, you're like, is this doomed? So my question is, given that sheer volume of human mass in and around, is Hanauma Bay, my beloved, looking at a dim future? I mean, something like that where...
Yeah. Well, they have put in regulations there on Oahu for Hanauma Bay that is trying to control how many people are allowed to go and what days of the week. So I think that really is like with a lot of national parks and other places, like it's not to fully exclude people, but also not to just allow unfettered access in a way that spoils it for everybody. And so I think those sorts of middle ground approaches are really key because if you have too many people in a place, even if they're there with good intentions, it can have a bad impact. But I think that, again, that's the role of regulations, is to like, people by themselves are not going to say, I'm going to sit this out for the good of the reef. I'm not going to go. You have to rely on the government or some other body to come in and be sort of for the greater good, deciding what is going to be beneficial for nature and being that voice for the reef.
Excellent. Let the record show I did wear the reef safe stuff, please. Okay, thank you. If you had an unlimited R&D budget for one piece of gear something that doesn't exist yet, what would you build?
The thing that we have talked about as something that'd be really helpful for coral photogrammetry is having some sort of either metaverse or hub for imagery where people can seamlessly upload their data and interact with it, both their data and other people's data, to really leverage up that economy of scale for being able to explore virtually and learn from other surveys and other efforts, and to be able to, again, share what we've seen, but you're not just limited to what your research group has done. You can see and learn from a bunch of different places. So I think that whether it's Samsung or other technology companies, there really is a role to play there of putting some of their tech and resources towards like hosting huge quantities of data, like petabytes of data, or creating easily accessible ways to view and access that data. I think that could be great both for the general public and for researchers and practitioners. So it's less a single piece of equipment, but in terms of trying to work towards developing something like that. And the team at Scripps and UCSD is working on that through this Samsung partnership of trying to create an app that can be part of the phone where users can upload data directly to Scripps, can be capturing media about their dive and their experience, and trying to make, again, something that's more user-friendly with the goal of having like a broader data ecosystem that is accessible and can be shared. So I think that it's something that is attainable. It's not like this pie in the sky thing, but it's definitely needs funding and needs tech support.
I think that's an exceptional, very, you mentioned, but feasible answer. I mean, we should be knocking the door of that. I know whether it's historic preservation, certain museums have, VR immersive based experiences. I can't imagine. Now, granted, certainly there's more complexity when you get in the underwater realm of things, but that can't be far off.
But you bring up a great point that I think that we so often get siloed, and there's so many silos we might not even know we're in. I know that in the coral reef space, it might be a question of like, well, do we try to broaden this beyond just corals to like other marine ecosystems? And no one's even talking about, do we try to broaden this to like the architecture space or like any sort of other space that also uses photogrammetry? And I think like there's probably a lot of problems that we could get over more easily if we just realize that we're not the first ones to try to figure this out. So it's a good point.
Is there a coral reef you think about more than others? A particular structure or colony? Sorry, is it colony, would you say? Yeah, that.
Yeah, for individual corals, it would be a colony. Yeah.
One that stands out for any reason.
Yeah, I mean, just having done a lot of research at specific sites in Maui, I think like I often will think about those sites, and it's such an interesting experience to spend hundreds of hours staring at a space of reef that's like maybe the size of someone's backyard, and you look at so many different aspects of it that like where individual corals are, like to the point where when you go into the field and you get like a fleeting 45 minutes with that site that you've spent so many hours with on the computer, and it's like you're kind of like fangirling over a site, even though it's like just because you're like, I've seen this so much and now I'm here in person and I can like go check out like this coral that I've stared at so much, has it changed? Or like, wow, look at, like, you notice all the little minutia just because you've spent so much time staring at it. Which, back to the AI question, like that's the type of thing that I hope we don't fully automate and outsource, of like that human intuition of being able to take observation and then make new observations because of that background. But yeah, just being able to, it highlights the utility of large area imagery and photogrammetry to be able to ask these more in-depth research questions that aren't limited by time, because we can spend as much time with it on the computer as we want or are able to. But like, then when you see that reef in person in real life, it just makes it that much more valuable of an experience, even though there's nothing objectively more special about those reefs than reefs in other part of the world. It's just because it's what I'm familiar with. And I think that a lot of other people in coastal communities around the world, they have such a strong connection to the place that they're familiar with. And so like, it's sort of no different from a researcher perspective. It's like just remembering that from a conservation point of view, that people care about their local place where they've spent most of their time. And I think there's a way for these visuals to help with that.
Okay, Doctor, we're rounding the bases here, and I want to be respectful of your time. So we're going to wrap the show up on a bit of a just fun get-to-know-you note for the masses who both follow and admire you. When the wetsuit is off, you reside in Philadelphia. What's a great part of the city that not many people would know about?
Yeah. Moved here almost 2 years ago now, and I grew up, as I said, on the East Coast down in DC, and have some family in Philly. Like my grandparents live here, my sister
Okay.
lives here now. So for me, it's great to see family. Really have enjoyed that after being in California for 5+ years for grad school. I've also really enjoyed the walkability of Philly, and I missed that while I was in California. And we live like right downtown, and there's a lot of like great coffee shops to remote work from, or just walking around in these cute little alleys that I know most cities, the alleys are like the part you avoid, but in Philly, there's just a lot of like really cute streets with like nice flowering trees and like cobblestone streets and like the brick, and it makes the scale of the city is more approachable from a walking perspective. Like there's other parts of it that make it less approachable. Like sometimes people's attitudes make it less approachable, even if it's a nice city to walk around in. But like Philly has its highs and its lows, so I really enjoy lots of aspects of living here, and it's actually my first time living in like the super urban core of a city, so I've been enjoying that a lot. And just having things accessible, whether it's walking or whatever, just having a lot of cool restaurants and other amenities very close. So
Cheesesteak. Over, under, or properly
yeah.
rated?
I'm not super into sandwiches, so I'll probably
Okay.
say overrated. I might get some hate for that, but I did miss having good pizza when I was on the West Coast. I feel like the East Coast has a lot better pizza, and there's a lot of good spaces not too far from us. And yeah, there's just a lot of good food diversity here, which is have been definitely taking
Yeah,
advantage
certainly.
of
I
that.
love the sandwich honesty, and there are a few better pivots from sandwich than pizza. So 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, yeah.
What could you give a 5-minute TED talk on that has nothing to do with your career or its focuses?
Yeah, I actually, when I was in high school, I got into pottery and kept that up. I actually haven't found a new studio since moving to Philly, but I did it both during undergrad and while I was in grad school as a side thing. And so I've like mostly like mugs, bowls, plates, that sort of like usable stuff rather than sculptures or anything like that. But I really enjoy making things on the wheel and glazing things and picking different colors, and I am looking forward to getting back into that, but it would be fun to do a TED talk about maybe even like I know the question is about not professionally, but using pottery to communicate things that you've observed in nature, something like that, bridging the
I'll
gap
allow
between
it.
those two
Absolutely.
things.
Yeah. It's tremendous. What was the last thing you changed your mind about professionally?
Hmm, that's a good question. Well, I'm currently working on with Seatrees, like a project that is focused on biodiversity credits to basically try to attract more sources of funding into conservation by creditizing um, the restoration work that we do. So saying like this one coral that we're planting, we're basically going to monitor that over a 10-year period and report on the impact, the biodiversity impact of that, and and then that can be sold to corporates who can basically share in that biodiversity uplift that comes from that. And I think that now I'm a firm believer that that is a potential for increasing funding for conservation and leading to good outcomes. And it's still a very nascent space, so there's a lot of room for the market to really come into shape. So I'm more of a believer in that now than I think when I a few years ago was much more skeptical that sort of a market-based mechanism like that could actually lead to positive impact, because there's just sort of viewing the market and corporations as more of a source of bad than of good. But I think working at Seatrees has really helped with seeing that there are a lot of corporations that do want to have a good impact, and so trying to give a an avenue for them to really make that put their money where their mouth is, and really try to have a positive impact.
Wonderful. Which individual have you learned the most from?
Yeah, I think in a not science perspective, I probably would say my parents, just like learning how to be a functional human being. And a lot of it has like the perspective of how to interact with other people, learning that from my parents, especially both sides of my family are very large, and interacting with a large family, there's like a lot of give and take, and recognizing that you're part of a bigger collective, and that you're not always going to get your way, and that other people's opinions have weight even if you don't agree with them. And I think that learning that through um, like learned from my family, but really learned from my parents' example. Those lessons are all very helpful for navigating the broader world, especially whether it's in a science setting or just even in an office space, and giving people grace and understanding that you're part of a team and not to take things too personally. The large family thing is a helpful starting ground for all that.
What are you excited to tackle over the rest of this year, Dr. McCarthy?
Yeah, I'm excited for like all the work that we're doing at Seatrees and onboarding new projects. In addition to the 3 projects you mentioned at the start of the call, we're exploring a partnership with a project in Costa Rica that could be one of the Samsung projects that we work with. So, like getting to collaborate with these local scientists and practitioners around designing monitoring programs and getting an understanding again, like if we really care about this site level detail and drivers of what's causing the ecosystem to change, helping them document that and working with them to understand all that nuance. It's a really cool learning opportunity. And it's outside of an academic space. It's really applied, but there's still the chance for that continued learning. So I think those sorts of partnerships and hopefully potential to travel and see some of those places in person. But really looking forward to all of that.
Excellent. Well, Dr. McCarthy, I think after this very granular conversation to which we did a gratitude, I think many people will be eager to follow that. So thank you so much for joining the Recap podcast and all you're doing to advance both innovation and conservation. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll keep in touch. Bye. If you enjoyed this scuba-style deep dive with Dr. Orion McCarthy and want to keep more like it coming your way, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode. You can explore more of Dr. McCarthy's coral-saving world through Seatrees and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Next week, we're back in studio with the history of reality capture in motor racing, with the flavor only the recap can deliver. You do not want to miss this one.